Welcome once again to Syntax Error, your pretentious philosophical pedantic podcast ostensibly about video gaming and related topics therein. Warning, this podcast contains mature language, content, and spoilers. You have been warned. Welcome back to Syntax Error. I, of course, remain Scott Thurlow, joined tonight by J. Ian Manzer.
Hello.
And Stephen Armosi.
Hi there.
Tonight we're going to be discussing two recently-ish movies that focus on video games and specific topics within them. One is going to be Atari Game Over, which explores sort of two sides within that of the story of the legend / urban myth, which turned out to be true, of Atari burying a number of E.T. cartridges in the desert of New Mexico, I believe it was.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one we'll talk about is Indie Game, the movie, which explores sort of the trials and tribulations of a couple recently established and sort of up-and-coming indie game developers and, you know, following their path through, I think it was in 2014. Both these movies are somewhat recent, but
I think it was
within
12.
a couple of years. Yeah.
I think it was 12. Yeah.
So is when, say, Super Meat Boy was being ported, etc. So it's those two guys we'll talk about. But the reason we're doing this at all is it seems that the culture of video gaming is becoming more in the forefront. Like, you would never have seen even documentaries about games probably 10 years ago or so. So these two ones we found interesting. There were a couple others that we're going to talk about, but these ones sort of did the best job of exploring the games or the topics about the games and about the people who made them, in fact. So I'll ask you guys first. Let's go to Steve-O. Which one did you like overall more and why?
So I was trying to figure this out earlier. I really like both of these films. I probably like the story behind Atari Game Over better, just because there's so much history there.
Right.
Indie Game, the movie, had an ongoing story as they were filming it, so you didn't really even the creator didn't really know what the end of it was going to be.
That's a good point.
So it's a little bit harder to kind of finesse that, I guess. Also, I thought that Atari had the boon of being done by a guy who was a screenwriter, so he knew what he was doing as far as
it was more
formatic
in that sense. Sure,
exactly. However, Indie Game had a lot of these little segments that kind of made you feel like you were right there with the creators as they were making a game, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah.
So overall, I would say I probably, enjoyed Atari a little bit better, but they were both really up there.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's sort of an unfair-ish question, but, you know, subjectively, which one you thought was better done, I guess. Cody?
Asking this question is asking what kind of documentary you like better.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Sure.
To build off of what Steve-O said, Atari dealt with known history, and thus the director could almost plot out. Not only was he skilled and with prior experience with storytelling, but he knew what the ending of this would be. And although perhaps not necessarily the dig, the main interest in the story is Atari's history.
Sure.
So he could piece that out as needed.
He had a vision of sorts, if you will. Yeah, I
agree
with that.
Indie Game was more of a, not, I wouldn't say meandering, but they didn't know where it was going. So they're piecing together, they're hoping at the end that it would have interesting conclusion. And it's kind of unfair also because since this happened in the past, I knew a couple of the developers. Even I'm not as into games as the rest of the people on this table, but I knew who these people were, and I knew that I knew Super Meat Boy was a success. I knew that Braid was a success. So I didn't. There was no, let's say, tension to whether their success would, to whether they'd be successful or not.
Sure, no, I get that. And it is interesting that because of the nature of the two stories, and like you said, Atari, there was more of a framework in place to tell a story, in a sense. Whereas, yeah, as you just pointed out, Indie Game, it was following them as they were developing the games, like the couple of people who were doing the games they were developing. And so, yeah, it was, I agree that, I think my pick is Indie Game, but very, very slightly, but only because of that fact that because it didn't, you're not sure what was going to happen.
Right.
I found that interesting. And I also just found it interesting in general to see the perspective of people who are, programming and creating games.
If I could make a metaphor here.
Sure.
Indie Game was more of like something like The Deadliest Catch or those type of documentaries which are dealing with in the present, will they not be successful? Whereas Atari was almost a historical work. Oddly enough, and the director admits at that point, he had prior experience with hunting down the Loch Ness Monster.
Right.
And that's kind of how it
feels.
Herzog. Yeah.
Yes.
It has the feel of that kind of semi-historical with that search element where you already know that the story isn't whether you're successful or not. It's about the myth behind
exactly.
it.
That's exactly what I'd say. And yeah, I mean, sure, of course you're right. And yeah, his enthusiasm sort of comes through because they also sort of cheekily make reference to Raiders of the Lost Ark through a little bit here and there throughout the movie, and even like the ending of it is a reference where like they're boxing up all the crap, all the cartridges that they dug up, like where they put the Ark. It was sort of like the same shot. It's an homage to that. But yeah, I agree. I think the most interesting part of it to me, we've seen it now twice, multiple times, is the history and the sort of the rise and fall of Atari itself and the video game industry at that time and how it was affected.
Right. I think so. I guess perhaps we're all speaking about this as though Atari Game Over was like completely in the past, but there was that element of like you don't really know what's going to happen in this one as well.
Sure.
Because they're doing the dig, but really the meat and bones of it was talking about the rise and fall of Atari, which was absolutely the most interesting thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree to that.
Like the dig at the dump in New Mexico was really like a big thing for a lot of people, but
sure, the heart of it isn't that.
But who really cares if they find anything or not? Like, what's really interesting about it is the interviews with Howard Scott Warshaw, who's the guy that developed E.T. and all the other people that were involved with that entire process.
Oddly enough, there was another documentary that we almost did called Video Game the Movie.
Yes.
Which I think I want to bring up now just for the simple fact of comparison.
Sure.
My big flaw with that was it was about the industry as a whole versus having any human elements. And both of these Atari and indie games really delved into the human element of the video game culture. Mm-hmm. And since we're speaking about Atari, and Steve, since you brought him up, Howard Scott Warshaw was almost a redemption story for him. It was a appeal to, look, this guy was so influential in the Atari, in game development over the history of it.
Yep.
That his rejection because of E.T. is kind of a black mark on the industry as a whole.
Yes, I agree with that. It's well said.
And I thought that's where my real strength is. I felt very bad for this guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's kind of a mild jerk, if I'm going to be honest.
He's a little bit full of himself.
I don't think so necessarily.
But I think that the thing that is interesting about both of these is that a lot of these game developers seem to be a little bit full of themselves, and perhaps have to be.
That's kind of the whole point. Yeah, that's
to really like forge new ground in this, in the video game industry.
Right. No, see, that's what I found most interesting. That the sort of the personality it takes, or at least attracts, that gravitates towards this line of work. It was very interesting to me to hear from their perspectives, and especially Howard Warshaw's, sort of legacy, if you will, that he's remembered for making, in quotes, as the movie points out, the worst game ever. But when they delve into more details about it, like the constraints under which he was told to make it, and like what was happening
in 5 weeks,
exactly, and what was happening at the company and in the industry at large in general, it gives you so much more perspective and breadth of history on it, and it explores again, like I said, excuse me, the urban myth about it. But it gives you so much more facets to it, and why, what led up to this thing.
And the other interesting thing is, just really quickly, is that while yes, he did make the game that's considered by a lot of people to be the worst game ever, he also made a lot of really, really good games for Atari, namely Yours Revenge and the Indiana Jones
adaptation. Yeah,
the Indiana Jones adaptation. So he had experience working, on a Spielberg movie before this, which I think is why he was trusted with it in the first place.
Another fascinating aspect is that both of these movies are incredibly pro-developer, in the sense they're kind of
that's true. Yep.
glossing over the business aspect of it. Although Atari has a great character, or not character, a real life person, Manny Gerard, who
seems like he would be a character.
Yes. Jerry Stiller he's absolutely this. If this was a fictional movie, that would be who playing them.
Sure.
But both of these are really dealing with like who the people are who construct and the culture behind that. And what's really fascinating to me is you have the Atari, which is dealing with kind of that both 80s culture and people who saw them as useful tools for making money and allowed them to run roughshod without control, which led to the collapse. It can be argued.
It contributed to it for sure.
They built up the hubris that led to it not making any money. And then you have the indie developers who are kind of outside the AAA industry of games, and you're seeing the constraints brought on them. But on both ends, you're not seeing the business aspect of it. This is very pro artist.
No, I agree with that. And yeah, it's sort of like whether intentional or not, or it's certainly contained within both. But you're right. But it sort of feeds back to these are human stories, and it's telling their perspective and their experience for what happened. And what I find interesting to connect it to is that Howard Warsaw was sort of like the first, if within the first generation, and I believe Nolan Bushnell, who was the a co-creator or founder of Atari, he said, yeah, we sort of created the lifestyle / workplace image of developers as rock stars, which sort of you can see comes through a bit, and at least, and say certainly like Phil Fish's perspective in Indie Game, and a little bit of that. So yeah, as you guys said, I think that's the heart of these stories is hearing those voices.
But if I can counter that for a moment,
sure.
In Atari, they were rock stars. They were women, booze, drugs, all of that. It seems that in indie games,
so they're certainly not having that atmosphere, but
it's
perhaps
more
the
of
mindset.
We are serious artists.
Sure,
we are tormented individuals who are producing great works that the average person doesn't, or at least Jonathan Blow came across as that way.
Yeah.
Well, it was entirely about that. Like, you regardless of like the two guys from Super Meat Boy, Tommy and Edmund, seemed, I guess, more down to earth than Phil Fish and Jonathan Blow did. But at the same time, there was still that feeling of these guys locked themselves in a house for like 16 hours a day, like every single day for however long it took, 2 years or however long it took to make the game. And that was what they did. Like, there's no social life. Whereas in Atari, they had a lot of the, well, if you hit this deadline, then we're going to party like it's the end of the world, basically. They said, who was it, Nolan Bushnell that said they created this atmosphere of like, if you hit your deadlines, then we're gonna go out, send somebody with a company card, buy a bunch of kegs, and bring them back, and we're gonna have a crazy ass party.
Yeah, sure. I'm just saying, like, it's sort of, you can see somewhat parallel, or again, like the evolution of it, perhaps, but there is like two different perspectives. Yeah,
maybe a little bit of the diva perspective, like in that you can see in Indie Game.
Like that, I agree with.
Yeah, the indie guys aren't, of course, throwing themselves parties. It's sort of like about their struggle to like you said, to create their art. They feel like they're unappreciated artists, which I think is legitimate.
Right.
I think perhaps the best thing that at least Indie Game did is that it shows you to a general audience. It sort of gives you a window to look into what creating art in this medium is actually like, or like the person that sort of is drawn to it, how they function and use their art within it.
I disagree.
Yeah.
Because you're broad brushing all of these people's intentions, which I think are very diverse here. I
don't know if I agree to that. Go ahead, though.
In Atari, it was, in a sense, like the Michael Bays of filmmaking.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Well, no, not really, because
they talk all about their hubris. They're pushing the limits of what. Yeah.
Well, they were inventing the medium as it was happening, which I think is an important aspect that I also find interesting.
But I think that's a parallel with Indie Game as well. They're inventing a new media, like a new game.
Kind of.
Yeah, but it's video games. I think this is a good demonstration of how video games have matured.
Right.
I'm sure
that's well said. I kind of wanted to say that myself.
AAA games probably have that same mentality that Atari did, or at least some companies probably do.
Yes.
Well, we're not watching the people making Super Meat Boy was a huge success for an indie game, but these are people making they're the young directors trying to come up.
Yeah,
where we're not talking about the people who are making Call of Duty here. We're not talking about the people making Assassin's Creed.
Sure.
I'm kind of interested in seeing the film about the version of Atari. I don't think it's fair to compare the people in Atari to the people in Indie in a way.
I wasn't necessarily trying to make a one-to-one comparison per se. Just sort of, again, the aspects that were portrayed in both that to me were obvious, sort of shared between them.
I think what is obviously shared between the two groups, though, is that, like, they are pushing themselves to the boundaries of what they can possibly do.
Sure.
And they're
willing to do it. Yeah.
And they're willing to do it. And I think that was obvious in both films, especially with when Warsaw was talking about in Atari, when Warsaw was talking about having to do ET in 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Because
which is fucking insane if you think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nuts.
But most people don't know that, or don't, it's not the number one. It's not the headline of the story, really.
So that's completely the opposite of what these indie game developers are doing.
No, that's a good point. You're right.
Because they're going out over a very long period, but at the same time, they're trying to do the same type of thing where they're pushing themselves to the limit of what they can do. They're saying,
because they're artists. As we just said.
Yeah, they're saying here's what we can do, and we need to make it better at any given point. There's a point where Phil Fish is talking about doing Fez, and he's talking about how he redid the game like 3 times because when he started the game, he was just learning how to do pixelated art.
Right. Yeah, I remember that part. Yeah, I liked it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then as he was going through, like, he got better at it, so he had to reskin the entire game, and then he had to reskin the entire game again when he got better, and like eventually he's doing like Tetris pieces,
yeah.
As part of his backgrounds and things like that.
But to the point, Atari, they're saying, had at its height 10,000 employees.
Mm-hmm.
To go into indie game and really
as opposed
delve
to the
into
2 people.
Phil Fish, although I know he gets a lot of hate, I'm even aware of that in the little tentative knowledge I have of tertiary knowledge. Phil Fish had a partner who basically left him with like legal issues.
Yes, true.
And he had to run everything himself almost.
Yeah, so he's. And you're right. I mean, just real quickly, he's making a game, or at least attempting to, while having those issues, all rolled into one.
Remember, Howard Scott Warshaw had Manny Gerard to run the business aspect of it.
That's true.
These people have, like, what was it? Tommy Rafinez?
Rafinez, I think.
Butcher his name. Apologize, sir. And Ed McMillan, when they're making Super Meat Boy, are also running their business aspect on
They're
their
doing
own.
it all themselves.
Yeah. Sure. I understand. We run the podcast, and that's a much less labor-intensive thing than developing a video game.
Yeah.
Sure. So, that's all true and all valid, and I don't disagree with any of it. It's just that what I just said, to me, is the most interesting aspect, but certainly that's all there, and I find that also interesting to, explore. At least, again, it's a window into something that you don't often see, and I think the greater point that I wanted to make is that the fact that these 2 films even exist focus on what would have maybe perhaps is perceived as a, lesser respected medium, in quotes, as other ones, but I think it's sort of, in a positive way, brings to the forefront that video games are just as valid as any other medium. You know what I mean? Like, the
Absolutely.
argument over other art, not like, it obviously is to me, but I think this sort of legitimizes that a bit more.
There is a point in indie game where one of them says, and I'm probably going to butcher this quote, but he's talking
I think I know
about,
which one you're going to say, so if you do, I'll try to correct you.
He's talking about how making a game is a combination of all other media.
It was Phil Fish. He was like, if you think about it, video games are every other medium that has ever existed rolled into one.
And again, I'm going to show my bias here because I do respect indie artists, whether you're doing filmmakers, musicians, or video game developers. Jonathan Blow is talking about how, I love the fact that people are giving me 9s and 10s on my games, except they're talking about the surface levels here. They're not delving into
they don't get my
true
art,
meaning.
man.
Yeah, sure, but that's that is how a true artist should react to that situation. It should be like that.
Well, perhaps he should keep it to himself a little bit more.
That's how you think
they
should react. But again, it's interesting to hear that perspective from the artists themselves. That's what they view it, in their game as.
I used to be friends with a lot of people at an art school in Rutgers, and all of them had that kind of
the pretentious tint a bit.
No, it's not necessarily pretentious. Okay. It's about the idea that they feel that this is their way of describing the world to other people.
Sure,
and
that's well said.
The hurt that comes with, you like this, but not for the right reasons. I get that, and I don't know, and I feel that if you want to make an argument for are video games a valid art form, just by hearing how people describe their artwork,
sure, of course,
absolutely,
that's kind of what I'm saying. Like I said, it's laudable that at least that film, takes that as sort of its not its central thing, but one of its major themes. I guess it certainly flows in and out, and you can hear again that perspective from the people who are the artists themselves creating this art in this certain medium. Actually,
and to further that, both our points, Ed McMillan's wife, I forget her name, Daphne or something like that, maybe?
Possibly. Sorry.
I apologize for that. But she's talking about how, almost defending her husband's pursuits to other people. And, finally, in a sense, he's just, his actions have been justified, but my defense of him has been justified as well.
Sure, yeah. Right.
It was all very touching. And
I agree with all that. No, and so all that's completely valid and, like I said, quite interesting to me, as I overuse that word in this episode. But also I wanted to explore the secondary thing, or since Atari cuts up sort of, again, two aspects, that my favorite quote when they were talking to Howard Warsaw again about, how E.T. was such a huge failure that it crashed the video game industry. He's like, I think it's really interesting that I'm the one guy who's credited with toppling $1 billion industry.
Although, to be fair, he kind of throws Steven Spielberg under the bus there.
Kind of. So I know you described it as such. And
according to Atari Game Over, Steven Spielberg is actually at fault for crashing the video game industry.
No, he's
Atari
at fault for,
anyway. He's at fault for greenlighting the game.
Steven Spielberg paved the way for Nintendo. Let's just say that.
I guess that's the argument here, like in a roundabout way. I don't know if I agree to that, but I suppose you could extract that.
Nintendo came out in '83. Atari basically failed in '83.
All right, no, fair enough.
That's all I'm gonna say.
Good job, Steven Spielberg.
Yes, yeah, thanks Spielberg for fucking that up to apparently. If you think that's the case,
but I prefer Nintendo over Atari, so it's good.
But no, it's still certainly fascinating to me that aspect of it. Many people perhaps can remember and or familiar with the crash, but this delves a bit more deeply into like versus the surface level thing that most people know about it and probably have never wanted to or had the chance to research further.
Well, to butcher a quote by Nolan Bushnell, he's talking about people prefer the simple story versus the nuanced truth.
Yeah. That's definitely true. And like I said, I think I have to give both of these films credit for trying to not present you a simple story, or at least on the surface, but then delving beyond that.
Right, give you a bit more nuance.
Exactly, to give you the ins and outs and the various perspectives and color to those who are within it.
And if you actually look at the subtext of what Manny Gerard had to say, it's mostly like Warner and the Atari execs who weren't paying attention to the money flow.
Guess what? It was the suits fucking it up again, and the artist got screwed in the end.
Oh, we lost $100 million this past quarter.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah, we'll make it up.
We'll figure it out.
But no, sure, true. And again, like the other half of the story is them digging up, and you mentioned it was a foregone conclusion, kind of. But at the time, in 2014, it was somewhat of a big deal when they released it and announced that, hey, we actually did find them. Sure, it wasn't like 1 million cartridges or whatever, but they found the landfill, and there they were.
Oh, to be fair, I'm gonna rattle these numbers off the top of my head, but I believe they found 1,300 of 700,000 supposed cartridges that got buried.
Sure,
and only a certain percentage of it were ET cartridges.
Yeah, like
it turned out that spoiler alert. It turned out that they were just dumping. It was just a company that was going under, dumping a bunch of their extraneous crap that they had that they couldn't sell. Like it was a bunch of different games. It wasn't just
right.
ET.
The point was it's not like E.T. was so bad that they had to dump it. I believe this also is a quote that I'm going to somewhat butcher, but E.T. became known as the worst game because it was dumped. Like not the opposite way around. It wasn't dumped because it was the worst game ever made. It was just a loss of a product. And I think the one again, either Manny or someone else points out that it was such a cheap and easy way for a company to get rid of product that they couldn't use anymore.
Yep.
It wasn't like they were like punishing Howard necessarily per se, although he did get punished because of it.
But by
in the wake of it,
public opinion punished him.
Exactly.
Yeah,
true.
And another interesting thing was like they have the Hollywood or not Hollywood, the video game like Hall of Fame, and
right, he's never been mentioned.
Howard Scott Warshaw, who made a bunch of the best Atari games, is not even on it, which is kind of brutal, Like
they said various people who were there at the time pointed that out in the film, and sure, of course, I agree with that.
Who knows? Maybe he's there
unfair,
now.
But...
We should do an update to this later.
Ernest Cline will get him in.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
I did. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I'm sure he's been working on that since this.
No, Ernest Cline and George R. R. Martin are gonna get in the DeLorean.
Go back in time.
Save,
Go back in time and save E.T.
Well, that sounds like a great plot to a game and/or film. So. But no, Ernest Cline, who wrote Ready Player One. They basically had a bunch of, I guess, semi-celebrities or again,
video game celebrities.
Popular nerds who talked about their love, for games growing up and how it affected them and what it drove them to do. And I also found it amusing that they pointed out when they were doing the dig, a line, people heard about it and started showing up as if it were like a concert or something. Like people were waiting to see a landfill, essentially.
And they all had terrible hipster mustaches.
They were all fucking nerds, of course, sure. But no, I mean, it was kind of, it sort of was demystifying the myth itself, or at least delving into it, and they ended up finding it. And like you said to me, E, that it was almost somewhat of a redemption tale for Warshaw himself, which, it kind of was in a sense, and I think that's a good thing about it.
Warshaw is now a psychologist in
Silicon Valley.
he has a master's degree both in engineering and in psychology, which is kind of neat. So to bring this up, he got closure here.
Sure.
Yeah.
He had his biggest failure in life. He had to see all these people who are fans coming
celebrated
out to see
it.
his
Exactly.
Work, and then a bunch of celebrity nerds or nerd celebrities, however you want to parse that, validating him. So good for you. I hope that he gets the recognition he deserves.
And he does say that he finally found a job that he likes as much as he liked that Atari job originally. Which, whether or not that's true, I think is kind of bullshit. But
he came across as really bitter at times.
Yeah,
somewhat. So, but perhaps reasonably so in a sense.
Well, he became the figurehead of the failure of Atari, and
sure became the face of it, but not really necessarily through a fault of his own. And certainly not just him.
So actually, since you're our resident video game scholar, Scott,
sure, or at least I claim to be.
Jonathan Blow, Phil Fish, Tommy
Tommy R.
and Ed McMillan. Where are they now?
I believe, Jonathan Blow just did The Witness. It was the game that you can't stop talking about how much you like. So, as I recall, after Braid, he worked on it for like 7 years, which is sort of like the topic they touch upon in any game. Like, like you were saying.
They mentioned that he's at work on it. Yeah.
Like how, so much time and effort it takes to make a game. I believe McMillan did, not with Tommy, but like as a side thing, or expanded the Binding of Isaac, and they did a couple of expansions. Phil Fish famously exited the video game industry altogether after a year or less into developing the sequel to Fez 2. He was like, basically, fuck it, I'm out, I'm taking the money, thanks. But Phil Fish is also notorious, we'll bring this up. I like what he has to say sometimes, but he can be the douchiest person as well. But again, maybe it speaks to the kind of person you somewhat need to be, maybe, to do this.
And I will say this,
as an artist even.
Before we go on, Tommy and Edmund are working on a game together still that they started working on, I think, shortly after Super Meat Boy. That was just called Mugenics, which is a game about weird cat stuff. I'm not even really sure. I tried to look it up.
I'm sure it's weird. See, Ed McMillan strikes me as the sort of the how should I describe it? He's like the ideas guy of that one of their partnership, where it just comes up. He even admits he's like, I have all these weird, crazy, fucked up drawings as a kid, and that's kind of shit that I liked, and that's what I'm gonna make a game about.
Again, I don't know if this is how accurate my interpretation is, but Ed McMillan seemed to have done all the work involved with Super Meat Boy.
He did again, like sort of the art creative, but I think Tommy
did all the coding.
Exactly, he was a software. He was like debugging. He was basically that was his part of it.
Huge part of it. Yeah.
He basically the technical side of it. And McMillan is sort of like the creative director, if you will.
That even came out at one point when they're talking about what their fears are on launch day, and Tommy says something like, I'm afraid that every single person that buys this is going to get the first save glitch and just lose their saves, and then they'll all return it, and then we'll be ruined. And Edmund's like, yeah, we have two very different views on this. Like, I know that that's a glitch that isn't going to affect many people, and we're going to fix it, so it's fine.
Yeah, sure. But again, it was interesting to see, their partnership they found a perfect balance between those two sort of sides of the coin, or at least a good balance, a good working relationship, which I found fascinating.
I thought Ed was the most down-to-earth person of the four people that they focused on in this.
I agree with that.
And I don't know, Tommy was kind of a nervous, which I can respect. Maybe it hit
He's
too
like
close
the Woody
to home.
Allen of making indie games.
He's very much a nervous. He actually reminded me a lot of Mike Krahuyak.
Oh, from, Gabe from Penny Arcade? Yeah, sure.
Just in the way that he kind of carries himself, and I think that they kind of are a similar type of person.
Sure, no,
so
I agree.
If you've seen Tommy in Indie Game the movie, then you've seen what
Mike
Gabe,
is like.
Gabe in real life is like from if you read Penny Arcade.
Sure, no, that's all fair, and like I said, I think it's quite fascinating to see into the lives of those people and see what they're like, making the medium that at least I gravitate towards the most.
What also fascinated me was the distinct type of lifestyles all these people had.
I was gonna bring that up as the next subject. Yeah, go ahead.
So Ed really worked from home basically, and his wife there, she's a cat person. It felt very, I don't know how to particularly describe it. It was very homey. It was very he's working almost like watching someone work from their basement. In a way. And Tommy to a certain extent as well. Where you had Phil Fish, who's working from a corporate
got an office. Yeah, well, he got a lot of funding because
In
they
Canada.
showed the game early on, and everybody got really excited about it. So they got a lot of funding from the government, I guess.
Yeah, well, they had a grant from the Canadian
Right.
like arts.
So
Go Canada.
He was
Yes.
able to, exactly, Canada.
That's why Canada's awesome. They
or,
pay.
or go to like Finland, and you can do
They'll
the
fund
same
your
type of
artistic, creative vision of a game.
thing. As
I
we-
might become an expat there after all.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, depending what happens, sure, in our election, but sure, no, I mean that's kind of again a laudable thing that Phil Fish happened to take advantage of because of where he lives and works. But no, like I said, it's all quite interesting to me, and I'm sort of glad that these films exist that expose more general audiences to
Right.
the workings and aspects, etc. What it's like to work in games and a bit of the business side of it. Perhaps we'll see another one that comes out that explores more of that.
I say I study and teach computer science.
Mm.
So when Jonathan Blow was working on the computer, I actually knew what he was doing there. So that was fun.
Yeah, a little
to,
Easter
see.
egg for you.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think that well, we're gonna probably towards the end of this season of Syntax Error watch a couple more
Yeah, we're gonna
documentaries.
do a follow up on sure.
And there are certainly more that have something to say about the industry. A lot of them seem to be like nostalgic, though. Like there's King of Kong and
Kind of, yeah. Now, King Kong's is a
there's the
more
video
fairly
game,
well known
there's
one.
video game the movie,
Yeah.
which seems like, how did you describe it?
I love the 80s
Yeah,
for video games.
Video game
Yes,
style.
and yes, it definitely was again more broadly and an overview, pretty much. You said another description was an introductory course instead of like a 200, 300 level course.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, I agree with that.
But
It's
there's
sort of why we didn't cut it out of talking in this discussion. But
yeah, but there certainly are more like modern day takes on this
Sure,
type
no-
of stuff. And
no
Indie
doubt.
Game, the movie, I think was an interesting jump into that, first foray into
Exactly.
in that world.
Well, what I liked what these two did, going to the nostalgic factor, because really, video game movie was propaganda, if you want to look at it.
Kind of, yes.
In a way, it was a defense of why video games are important.
yes,
Where in these two, Atari and indie games allowed the people to speak for themselves.
Mhm.
that's a good point.
Especially indie games wasn't really attempting to establish a narrative. They were allowing these people to live their lives and you to follow their trials and tribulations along
Right.
with
Yep,
them.
exactly.
And Atari, yes, it did have a point, but again, except for one scenario when he calls him out for Howard Warshaw for calling out Steven Spielberg, the
Again, that was
director
sort of
was
a bit tongue in cheek, but still,
director was very hands off with allowing people to explain
yes,
how Atari rose and fell on their own.
Mm-hmm.
sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, yeah, they were both well done. I recommend them both if you or have a passing interest in games, or if you're just a gamer but want to learn more about the people behind the games. I definitely recommend it, and I hope we'll see more of them. I think I'll leave off, as I recall, recently-ish, Tim Schafer, who's also like a big, well-known former indie gamer, but now he's sort of has his own studio. But he, I believe, was doing sort of video logs, like little half-hour things of like him and his team working on whatever game they're working on.
That's kind of
Which we certainly can perhaps talk about those. But I think it's cool that perhaps more things like this we will come out and give you more insight into the process of making games and the people who are again gravitate towards making them and have their creative vision and decide to that games are their outlet for it.
And hopefully we'll be able to create something similar to this audio-wise. So, Steve-O,
And probably not.
get all these people on the horn.
All right, let me
Yeah.
see if I can get all of them on.
We'll
the
be
horn.
talking to everybody that we mentioned shortly as well. But no, I mean, like I said, I think that's pretty much all we really can say about it. But I appreciate the fact that it's becoming more in the forefront, and we're going to delve a bit more into it. But just that video games get the respect they deserve, and the people who make them also that.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge thing that they're starting to be this culture around the creation of video games,
Right.
as opposed to just
Exactly.
taking them as objects.
Right,
like
as product per se.
they're now we're taking a look at what it takes to make them, what it takes to create an industry around them,
Mhm. For sure.
that type of thing, which is really an interesting thing to look at.
To go a little bit into self-aggrandizing here, what we do on Syntax Error isn't about a defense of video games as an art form. We assume that it's an
a
art
given.
form
Right.
and that we're discussing it critically.
No, you're right.
And I think that while I'm not going to say it is done
We're
overall,
single-handedly responsible. But
I feel that it is being accepted and that we're one of the critics that are going to be discussing video games in the future as they deserve to be, a
Right.
medium which
No, sure.
can give a message and is important.
Exactly. No, I agree with that, and I think I just again think it's good that it's being brought more to the forefront by us and by others, perhaps more professional and just more exposure in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
Got anything else? Final
No.
things? Yep. I think me
that's
either.
about it.
All right. So, yeah, check out these movies for sure if you're interested. Again, it's a fascinating look into the lives and the work and the struggles that go into making games.
As of now, as of this recording, they're both available on Netflix.
Yep.
And we'll absolutely put them up on the website as well.
Sure. So, I think that'll do it for Syntax Error tonight. I, of course, remain Scott Thurlow, as always. I was joined by Stephen Amosi.
Have a good night.
And Janie Manzer.
Good night.
See you next time.
This has been Syntax Error. Thank you as always for listening, and we will see you next time.
Music by Stephen Ormosi. Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow.
Syntax Error is part of a Lost Signals Productions. All rights reserved.